Okay, so colleagues, thanks again for being with us here today on this press conference by Mr. Ian Fry, who's the Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of human rights in the context of climate change. Mr. Fry, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I've just given my first ever report to the UN General Assembly today, the third committee. This is the first time as the Special Rapporteur for the promotion and protection of human rights. So I gave an indication that climate change is the largest, most pervasive threat to the natural environment and societies that we've ever experienced. And the poorest countries are paying the highest price, as we've just recently seen floods in Pakistan, Nigeria, and the current droughts in the Horn of Africa. So there are various human rights being affected as a consequence of climate change: the right to life, health, food, self-determination, water, sanitation, freedom from violence. And we heard yesterday from the Special Rapporteur on violence against women, there is a strong connection between the impacts of climate change, women being put into vulnerable situations because of climate change, and the subject to violence. So there is a massive injustice being manifested by the major economies on the poorest people. The G20 countries, for instance, account for 78% of global emissions over the last decade. So I looked at sort of a few issues. I wanted to look at the whole issue of the fact that we're creating a human rights catastrophe as a consequence of climate change. And the most affected are suffering the greatest loss, but least able to be involved and the least able to participate in current decision making. So this is what I call a participation disconnect, where women, youth, children, people with disabilities, Indigenous peoples are not having a say in the process of decision making on climate change. So the other critical issue is that we're seeing climate rights defenders being persecuted by governments and security organisations, with some being killed, and particularly in Indigenous peoples organisations, and Indigenous peoples are particularly being targeted in this respect. So I made some recommendations to the General Assembly as part of my report. The critical one is that I was calling on the Secretary General to establish a high-level mitigation commitment forum next year, to sort of ramp up the efforts by all countries to reduce their emissions and get high-level political commitments on that. I was also suggesting that we need to establish a consultative group of finance experts to define the modalities for what's called a loss and damage finance facility. We know the costs of climate change are in the order of trillions of dollars now. And so we need some sort of finance facility to address the impacts that countries are suffering. And so there are discussions in the climate change arena, and there will be discussions at COP27 around a loss and damage fund. But I'm saying we have to think outside the box and think, in the orders of magnitude much greater than what possibly could be considered in a climate change meeting. We need to find some sort of redress and grievance mechanisms for those most affected by the impacts of climate change, and how they can find recourse for their damages. And we have to find a way of creating some sort of mechanism to give protection to climate rights defenders. And I challenged all those delegates who were at the meeting that they should be committing to bringing youth and children onto their delegation at the climate change meeting, to really allow the voice of youth and children to be heard at the meeting. So that was generally the sort of perspective, and I'm happy to take questions.
Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Ibtisam Azim from Al Arabi Al Jadid newspaper. First, on behalf of the United Nations Correspondent Association, thank you for the briefing. So my question, I have two questions. One about, the first one, I'm not sure if it's part of your mandate, but if you could say to the issue of environmental changes and human rights in the occupied Palestinian territories, to which specifically I'm thinking about on farmers, olive trees, cutting, water resources, etc. And then my second question is a follow-up on what you said regarding minorities and indigenous people and the fact that they don't have a say on the table. And the question here is, how do you want to make this possible? If you could maybe go more on like countries like the US and the situation of indigenous people here, and whether the government here is listening to what you are saying. Is it serious steps that they're taking? Thank you.
Well, on the first question about sort of occupied territories and the connection to climate change, what we're seeing throughout the world, and particularly in some regions where we're seeing this interface between climate change and land disputes and security issues. We're seeing that in the Sahel region and other parts of the world. And there are even suggestions that the war in Syria originated from a long drought. There was a 9-year drought. People migrated from the dry areas, from the agricultural areas into the cities, and that caused unrest. So we are seeing that connection, and I'm certainly looking into the connections between climate change and security issues, and that's a sort of fundamental sort of connection, and particularly the connection between people displaced as a consequence of climate change. We're seeing millions of people per year being displaced from their homes as a consequence of these events. So this is droughts, floods, as a consequence of that, and that's causing all sorts of issues. With respect to the Indigenous peoples' issues, well, I come from Australia and similar issues there. In fact, a group of people from the Torres Strait went to the Human Rights Committee and a sort of complaint against the Australian government that it wasn't meeting its obligations on climate change, and the committee found in favour of that group because there's just not enough being done to protect Indigenous peoples globally. And they're right at the forefront of the climate change impacts because of their connection to the environment. They're the ones most likely to be affected. And we heard from the Special Rapporteur on toxic chemicals this morning that a lot of Indigenous territories are being affected by developments that for mining and other things, particularly for mining for lithium and that has a connection to climate change as well. So there are serious connections there.
Yes, Joseph Klein from Canada Free Press. I also have two questions. First, could you share with us the names of the countries that where the most egregious targeting of climate change activists are occurring? And secondly, the second question is about the fund that you mentioned, the damages fund. Who would administer it, number one? Secondly, given the fact that the $100 billion a year pledges have not been met, and given the economic conditions in the world today, what are the realistic prospects that this proposal would be accepted, let alone actually funded? Thank you.
Well, as far as human rights defenders are concerned, there are many countries that there are concerns. I've received comments from groups in Brazil, Philippines, Vietnam. There are many countries where environmental rights defenders are being persecuted. With respect to, how to administer a fund like this, I mean, what I'm saying is we have to think outside the box and not just rely on public finance, because we know that the governments haven't delivered on the 100 billion that was promised in 2009. The estimates suggest that maybe 89 billion has come forward, but studies by Oxfam suggest that maybe half that amount. That it's only half has been delivered as grant finance. The rest is loans. So we have to think outside the box, and that's why I'm suggesting we establish a sort of a group of climate finance experts to look at other sources of funding other than just direct government finance. So this could be levies on airlines, it could be fossil fuels, drawdowns from the IMF. There are a variety of ideas being considered, and also issues around debt relief programs as well. So there are ideas out there, and even if we look at the issue of public finance, we know that in the first few months of this year, the amount of money that's gone into Ukraine, surpasses that 100 billion that was promised in 2009 for climate change. So the money is there if the will is there, and if countries are willing to accept that climate change, we're in a climate change emergency.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Laura. Mr. Fry, you described it as a massive injustice inflicted by major economies on poorer nations. There have been calls at the UN, we hear them almost every day, that the countries who are responsible for the biggest amount of emissions should pay for extreme weather events like the ones you mentioned, Somalia, Pakistan. How much are you seeing that this idea is gaining traction among those big powers that are the big emitters? Because as far as we can see, these calls are falling on deaf ears when it comes to them.
Yes, to a significant degree, that's a problem, I think, and that's why I'm, suggesting we need to sort of look at other sources of finance rather than direct finance. We know Scotland and Denmark have made pledges to a loss and damage fund, but this is only in the millions of dollars. And while we think that that's a worthwhile contribution, it's nowhere near the order of magnitude of money that's required. So we have to think at other sources for that funding.
Hope that actually the big powers are going to pay for these events, and now we're looking for other sources.
We're trying to find other sources rather than just direct government finance, because it has, there is a reluctance for countries to put up money, particularly around loss and damage. But I think the alternative is that we'll see these big countries and the boards of these big of companies being sued for their lack of action on climate change, and we're seeing increasing amount of climate change litigation occurring. And so, these are the choices that the governments, the board directors of major companies are going to have to make. Are they going to suffer the costs awarded against them for these climate change litigation, or should they be proactive and come forward with new finance?
What is your view of the COP26? It's coming up next month, COP27. We saw COP26 and the big deal that was made out of it, and everyone was talking about it, and every politician was pushing for those goals to be met by the end of the year or by 2030. What are your hopes for COP27? Is this just another event, or what's...
Well, clearly, because it's being held in Africa, there's an expectation there will be greater support, particularly for countries in Africa, and particularly because of the impacts that countries in Africa are currently suffering. I have to say I'm not all that enthusiastic about the possible outcomes. Having just been in a session now here, and still there's pushback, particularly on this whole loss and damage funding, I think. And so I'm not overly optimistic that there'll be a substantial breakthrough in this, but, we can only hope.
Go ahead, and then we'll go to Mr. Klein.
Yes, thank you. You mentioned the levy on airlines as one example. Are you suggesting a global levy on airlines, uniform, throughout all the airlines and all the at least member states of the UN? And secondly, are there any other global taxes that you're thinking about outside the box that, for example, some kind of uniform carbon tax? Could you just elaborate on that?
Well, to be honest, I'm not a finance expert. I mean, these are ideas that have been brought to me. I call for submissions. There are various ideas, a global carbon tax, a levy on airlines, drawing on funds from the IMF, the drawdown funds. So these are all ideas that are on the table from various people. And I think it's just important to have a dialogue and see how feasible they are, to see whether they can make a reasonable contribution. But so I don't have a formula myself. I just want to establish a process where these sorts of ideas can be put on the table and see if they're feasible.
I have a follow-up, because you talked about other sources of financing when it comes to loss and damage. Could you elaborate on that? What do you what do you see? Which ideas are discussed there?
Yeah, well, as I was just saying, there are forms of levies that we could apply to the use of fossil fuels in various ways, so that we're drawing from the use of fossil fuels to fund the loss and damage mechanism. So levies on our airlines and other mechanisms like that could help do that. The international community created a fund to deal with oil spills, and the shipping industry put into a fund, a solidarity fund for oil spills. So this is it's possible that the industry can make a contribution to these sorts of initiatives for loss and damage.
Go ahead. Sure. Yes.
Short questions. I'm just interested to hear more about the climate change links with women, with violence against women. Mm-hmm. I know we hear that a lot and we read about that a lot, but can you make it more clear for us how the two are connected? How does climate change lead to violence against women?
Yes, thank you. There are circumstances, but we've seen where women are put into situations where that they have to walk long distances to get water from their homes, and that puts them at risk. We're also seeing a situation. I was recently in Bangladesh, and just saw the impacts of climate change there, the impacts of Cyclone Amphan there, and we're witnessing 300,000 to 400,000 people migrate annually out of these climate change affected zones into the cities, and a lot of them end up in informal settlements in slum areas, around Dakar and those areas, and this is happening all around the world, and that puts women in vulnerable situations because they don't have stable housing, there's no formal security, and women may have to walk long distances to seek fresh water, and that puts them in vulnerable situations.
And one last one on Syria. It's fascinating what you just said, that the war may have started from a drought. Do you have more? Can you elaborate a little more on that? Where can we find more about that?
Yeah,
also?
I mean, there have been some papers published around that, that there was a 9-year drought, and people from the rural areas, after 9 years of drought, migrated to the cities, and that created unrest, and it was one of the, I mean, obviously there are bigger issues within that, but certainly it appears to be a sort of, a contributor to the destabilized country.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Last one. Okay. So I want to go back to the first question I asked you, because you talked about all these other issues but actually not about the occupied Palestinian territories. And let me paraphrase my question maybe. Do you see a connection between climate change, occupation, and the violation of Palestinian human rights in the occupied Palestinian territories? And if so, how? Thank you.
Well, I haven't gone into that one in any depth, but I clearly, you know, if people don't have access to the resources and they're in fragile situations, you know, through forms of oppression, political oppression, and then they are subject to climate change, you know, it just creates an additional problem for those countries, and I think we're seeing that already.
Yes, I feel like we're in a seminar here, this kind of back and forth dialogue, and I thank you for sharing your thoughts with us. But the Secretary General just recently and in other past statements has talked about emphasizing the need for funding of adaptation in the developing world. He didn't so much focus at all on this idea of loss and damages funding. You have mitigation, and then more focus on adaptation. So I'm wondering whether you've shared any of your thoughts directly with the Secretary General about expanding the scope of funding to reach damages, and how you see, in terms of the developing world, priorities in terms of adaptation versus building up a fund for damages for past events.
Well, you know, having been involved with climate change negotiations for many years, before I took on this position, I was the ambassador for climate change for the government of Tuvalu, a small Pacific island country. So we've been pushing very hard for adaptation finance, and part of the deal was that the Green Climate Fund would provide 50% funding for adaptation and 50% for mitigation activities. That you know, breakup hasn't occurred. So there's a major deficit in adaptation finance. So that's one issue. I have spoken to one of the advisors to the Secretary General about this idea of a loss and damage fund, but these are only preliminary discussions, and it's really, you know, to talk to the member states that are here, and that's what I was doing this morning, to sort of, you know, bring that issue to the fore. We know that all the developing countries have pushed for an agenda item at the COP27 on this whole loss and damage fund. So it's out there. It's a matter of how that happens.
But given the reality of competing demands on funding and, again, the economy today, do you see kind of a conflict in priorities between adaptation going forward versus trying to make up for damages caused in the past? Or do you see them as complementary to each other, assuming there's enough funding to fund both of them?
Yes, we have to think of them as, you know, complementary. You know, I mean, losses, damage is based around the concept that there are limits to adaptation. That there is so much can be done, but the impacts of climate change are so great that we can't completely build resilience against the impacts of climate change. And as we've seen, you know, Pakistan, Nigeria, there's no amount of adaptation funding could have protected those countries from those droughts, or you know, the current drought in Somalia as well. Those are just global problems that you know, you can do some work on adaptation to sort of minimise that effect, but inevitably those sorts of impacts are beyond what can be done as far as adaptation finance. So we have to take that next step. We shouldn't abandon funding for adaptation, and certainly there's some good work going on in that area, but we have to take the next step and realise that you know, we're reaching the sort of limits of how adaptation, what can we do with adaptation, and the enormity of the issue is now telling us we have to, you know, support loss and damage.
Go to the chat. I don't see any questions in the chat. Any more questions? No, I think. Thank you. Oh, yeah, of course. Yeah, okay. We'll go to one last question and then we'll wrap up.
Two very short ones. The self-determination part that you mentioned, could you give us an example of that? Does this, for example, apply to the Palestinian situation? Or what's an example of the impact of climate change on the capacity of people for
Well,
self-determination?
we're seeing, in parts of sub-Saharan Africa, and that where there are disputes around territories, and we're seeing, traditional movements of people, the herders and things like that, having to move further afield as a consequence of climate change. If we look at the drought around Lake Chad, we're seeing people having to, expand, their movements and therefore sort of crossing over boundaries, and that's one of the issues. The other issue is around Indigenous peoples as well, where their territories are not necessarily recognised by, as state borders, and as climate change affects them, they have to move further afield, to find the necessary food and water and shelter. So that issue of territoriality is another issue connected to climate change.
And on adaptation, I don't know if I was a little surprised that you didn't show a lot of enthusiasm for the work that's being done on adaptation. Usually when we hear other experts on climate, they call it the orphan child of the climate talks, because no one wants to talk about adaptation, everyone wants to talk about mitigation. And then we heard, for example, from, let's say one example, the Gates Foundation and the adaptation work they're doing in Africa, from resistant seeds to different kind of soil, and they have, how is that not, why are you not, do you agree that, do you agree that it's orphan child of the talks?
I have a limit to what I can do in my reports, and I think the sort of urgency of the situation of looking at loss and damage, and because it's a a political issue for this COP, that I did focus on that issue, and just the cost of the damage as we've seen in recent years. I looked at the damage by the cyclones in Mozambique, in Zimbabwe, where we're seeing enormous costs to those countries. So I did focus particularly on the loss and damage issue because of the magnitude of the problem. But I'm certainly not abandoning action on adaptation.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Fry.
Thank you.
Thank you all for your questions.